My half-sister stole my husband, ruined my life, and now she wants me to bless their wedding. My name's Helen, I'm 51 now, and I was married to Richard, who's 56 for 14 years. Though only 12 of them were on paper. And for most of that time, I would have sworn we were living the dream. Heart to heart. Soul to soul. He was my best friend, my person, my other half. We met when I was 37. I'd just come out of a rough patch. Divorced, disappointed, disillusioned with the whole idea of love. And then came Richard. Tall, charming, this warm voice that felt like safety and home in one. We met at a local art gallery. He was there for some corporate event, I was just passing through to distract myself. We ended up talking for over an hour by a sculpture neither of us understood, and he walked me to my car with a smile I can still see clearly if I close my eyes. Our relationship bloomed fast, but it never felt rushed. Within a few months, we were practically inseparable. We started living together within the year, and although we didn't get legally married until 2 years later, mostly because I had some paperwork mess left over from my previous marriage, we were already functioning like a husband and wife. And honestly, it felt like we were meant to be. Richard was everything I'd hoped for in a partner. He listened. He cared. He made me laugh so hard my cheeks would hurt. He'd bring me tea in bed every morning. We'd cook together, dance in the kitchen, binge-watch old black and white films on rainy weekends. And when things were hard, because life is always going to throw something at you, he was steady, calm, supportive. Like when I lost my mom in 2013, and I thought the grief would eat me whole, he never once made me feel like I was too much. He just held me, quietly, for as long as I needed. 4 years we had this rhythm. Every Sunday we'd make breakfast together. Him on the eggs, me on the pancakes, and then we'd sit on the porch, sip coffee, and talk about our dreams. That was our thing. We weren't rich, but we had just enough, and we were content. He worked in logistics, and I was a dental hygienist. We weren't flashy. We just fit. People always told us they envied our connection. And I'll admit, I wore that pride like a badge. Because after the hell I'd been through in my first marriage, gaslighting, financial control, emotional neglect, I felt like I'd won the damn lottery. Richard wasn't just a rebound. He was the antidote. Or so I thought. I look back now and see all those evenings on the couch, him rubbing my feet while we watched TV, or the way he always knew when I needed space and when I needed a hug. We'd go on long walks after dinner just to talk about nothing. We'd take weekend trips to small towns and antique stores, just because. We even wrote a bucket list together. Number 1 on the list? Renew our vows in Italy for our 15th anniversary. So, after years of what felt like the perfect marriage, something began to shift, and at first I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was small things, subtle, nothing I could point to and say, this is wrong, but enough that the rhythm we'd once shared started to feel offbeat. Richard, who used to look up the moment I walked into the room, began keeping his eyes glued to his phone. He used to come home and tell me about his day, ask about mine, and we'd swap stories like best friends do, but slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, those conversations grew shorter, less frequent, and more one-sided. I noticed he'd go silent at dinner, sometimes barely even responding if I asked a question. I'd have to repeat myself just to get a half-hearted yeah or from him. He started taking his phone everywhere, even to the bathroom, something he never used to do. I remember joking about it once, saying, "You glued to that thing now?" And he just laughed it off without even looking at me. The worst part was how quickly I began to feel like a stranger in my own marriage. The real red flag came one evening when I saw a notification light up on his screen while he was in the kitchen. It wasn't the name that caught my eye, it was the tone of the message. It said, "Last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach dropped. I froze for a moment, unsure if I'd read it correctly, but when he came back into the room and saw me near his phone, he suddenly tensed up. He grabbed it quickly, muttered something about work, and excused himself to the garage for a call that lasted almost an hour. That's when I started paying closer attention, and what I saw broke my heart more than I could have ever imagined. He would get messages at odd hours, late at night, early in the morning, and he'd always step away to answer them. He changed his phone's passcode, something we'd never even bothered with before because we trusted each other completely. There was one night when he left the room to take a call, and when I followed 10 minutes later, I could hear his voice from the hallway, soft, almost intimate, nothing like how he spoke to me anymore. When he noticed me standing there, he ended the call abruptly and gave me that same tired line, "Just work, Helen. It's nothing." But it was something. I wasn't imagining it. The emotional distance between us had become a canyon. He stopped holding my hand. He stopped noticing the little things. He stopped saying, "I love you," without me saying it first, and even then, his voice sounded flat, empty, like he was just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. I tried to tell myself it was stress from work, or that maybe he was going through something he wasn't ready to talk about. I gave him space. I tried to be patient. I made his favorite dinners. I planned a weekend getaway like we used to do. He canceled last minute, said he had to catch up on some reports. But later that night, I saw his location was nowhere near the office. He'd turned off sharing completely by the next day. I felt like I was going insane, second-guessing everything. Was I overreacting? Was I reading too much into things? But deep down I knew. I knew the man who once used to stare at me like I was the center of his world now looked past me like I was part of the furniture. And the silence between us, the space he put between us, physically and emotionally, was the loudest confirmation of all. So after weeks of feeling like something was off, constantly questioning myself, wondering if I was imagining things or if Richard was just going through some personal crisis he couldn't talk about, I decided to do something spontaneous. I'd been thinking about how distant we'd become and figured maybe if I made a small, thoughtful gesture, it might remind him of what we had. I'd picked up lunch from that Thai place we used to go to when we first started dating, the one that made his favorite green curry, and I decided I'd swing by his office around noon to surprise him. Just a quick visit, a sweet gesture, maybe even sit down for 20 minutes and talk like we used to. Something simple to break the routine and reconnect. But when I got there, the receptionist looked confused. She said Richard had already left for an early lunch. That didn't make sense. He hadn't mentioned any plans that morning. I thanked her, tried to keep my smile on, and walked back out to my car feeling a bit deflated. I sat there for a minute, the takeout bag on the seat next to me still warm, the smell of curry filling the car, and that's when I saw him. Across the street, coming out of the building, there he was. Richard. But he wasn't alone. He was walking toward a nearby bar. Nothing fancy, just one of those low-key places with dark windows and a small patio. And walking next to him, laughing at something he said, was my half-sister Julia. At first, I thought it had to be a coincidence. Maybe she just happened to be there, maybe it was some kind of weird meeting, maybe I didn't know something. But then I saw it. Richard reached for her hand and she took it without hesitation. They were holding hands. Not like family. Not like two people having a friendly chat. They were holding hands like a couple. Like people who were comfortable, familiar, close. The kind of closeness that doesn't come from nowhere. I froze. I literally couldn't move for a second, just sitting there watching them walk side by side, fingers intertwined, their bodies angled toward each other like it was the most natural thing in the world. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I didn't even know what I was feeling. Shock, confusion, betrayal, it all hit me at once like a wave crashing over my head. I just kept watching, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to convince myself there had to be some other explanation. But there wasn't. As they walked inside the bar, laughing, her hand still in his, I knew exactly what I had just witnessed. I didn't follow them inside. I didn't need to. That image was already burned into my mind. My husband, and my half-sister, together, holding hands in broad daylight like they didn't have a care in the world. So to understand the full weight of what I saw that day outside the bar, you need to know who Julia is, who she really is. Julia is my half-sister, technically my stepfather's daughter from a previous relationship. She's 7 years younger than me, and ever since she came into our lives, she's been a thorn in my side. From the outside, people used to call her charming, pretty, magnetic even, but behind that surface, she was always calculating. Manipulative in a way that only certain people know how to be, covert, polished, and always with a smile. Growing up, Julia never missed a chance to undermine me. She would turn everything into a competition. If I got praise for something at school, suddenly she was top of her class. If I wore something nice, she'd make a snide comment about how it didn't suit my body type or that I should maybe try a darker color next time. It was always subtle, always just under the line of what you could call outright cruelty, but it added up. Her favorite targets were my appearance and my confidence. I wasn't stick-thin like she was, and she never let me forget it. She'd say things in front of people like, "Helen's got such a cute face," then pause just long enough to let the implication settle. She knew exactly what she was doing. And my parents, especially my stepfather, always brushed it off. "She's just a kid," they'd say. "You're older, be the bigger person." So I learned to swallow it, to ignore it, to pretend it didn't sting when she wore my clothes without asking and then made sure to mention how they fit her better. To pretend I didn't care when she turned friends against me with her innocent act and whispers behind my back. but nothing hurt quite like the way she acted around Richard. Back when Richard and I were engaged, Julia was in her early 20s and already used to being the center of attention. I didn't think much of it at first, she'd always been a flirt with everyone. But there was something different about the way she acted around him. She'd lean in too close when talking, laugh a little too hard at his jokes, compliment his shirts or his cologne in this overly familiar way. I remember one time at our engagement dinner, she touched his arm and said, "Helen's so lucky, you're such a catch." It was said in that way Julia always did things. Just enough to pass as a compliment but always with an edge. I shrugged it off at the time. I trusted Richard. I thought Julia was just being her usual attention-seeking self. I told myself it didn't matter. That there was nothing to worry about. Looking back now, I feel like a fool. Because maybe the signs were there all along and I just chose not to see them. So after everything I'd seen, after the endless nights replaying that moment outside the bar and the weight of betrayal sitting in my chest like a stone, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I wasn't going to stay silent while the two of them, Richard and Julia, walked around pretending nothing happened. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I needed the truth out and I needed the people around us, our family, to see it too. This wasn't going to be some quiet breakup. I wanted everyone to know exactly who they were. That weekend, my mother and I had already planned a family dinner. It was supposed to be something simple, just a little get-together to catch up with everyone. But instead of canceling it, I saw an opportunity. I decided that would be the moment. That would be the night I exposed everything. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could. Screenshots of Richard's texts with Julia. Photos I had taken from a distance outside the bar and later, when they thought no one was watching. Messages she had sent him that he carelessly left open on his email. All of it. I compiled it into a slideshow. Nothing fancy, just enough to be clear and undeniable. And then I waited. The dinner started normally. Everyone arrived in good spirit. Laughter, wine, polite conversation filled the room. Julia even smiled at me when she walked in like she hadn't a single care in the world. Richard looked tense, but kept up appearances. My heart was pounding the entire time, but I stayed calm. I waited until the main course was cleared, the plates set aside, and the conversation had settled. Then I stood up and said I had something I wanted to share. I thanked everyone for coming, then walked over to the small projector I had set up in the corner of the room. People looked confused, curious. Some thought I was going to show family photos or something sentimental. And in a way, I guess I did, just not the kind anyone was expecting. The first image appeared on the screen, a blurry but unmistakable photo of Richard and Julia holding hands outside the bar. The room went silent. Then came the screenshots, flirty texts, suggestive messages, references to meeting again soon. Message after message, photo after photo. There was no mistaking it. There was no room for denial. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped a glass. My aunt started crying almost immediately. My cousin covered her mouth in shock. My stepfather turned pale. My mother just sat frozen, her eyes locked on Julia. For a moment, no one said anything. Just silence and the sound of the slideshow continuing frame by frame. Then came the voices. Questions. Yelling. Julia stood up, trying to say something, trying to spin it, but she couldn't get the words out. Richard sat there stunned, his face drained of all color. My uncle looked at him like he wanted to hit him. My sister-in-law started shouting about betrayal. People stood up from the table, shaking their heads, some refusing to even look at them. Julia tried to cry. She really did. She put her face in her hands and let out these theatrical sobs, but nobody bought it. Not this time. My mom stood up and said one thing. "You did this to your own sister," and then walked out of the room. Richard didn't say a word. Not one. He just sat there, completely humiliated, surrounded by the mess he helped create, unable to look anyone in the eye. He tried to leave quietly, but not before my cousin called him a coward and told him he disgusted her. The dinner ended in chaos. Plates were left on the table, half-filled glasses forgotten. No one stayed to clean up. No one said goodbye to Julia or Richard. They were left sitting there, side by side, exposed in front of the very people they thought they could fool. So after that night, after the entire family saw the truth with their own eyes and the illusion was shattered in the most public way possible, I didn't waste any more time. I told Richard to get out of the house that same night. There was no discussion, no argument, no begging. I looked him in the eye and said, "You are no longer welcome here." He didn't fight it. He packed a small bag in silence, walked out the front door, and that was the last time he ever stepped foot in what used to be our home. I filed for divorce the next morning. I didn't need to think about it. I didn't need space or time to cool off. I was done. I contacted my lawyer, gathered the paperwork, and made it official. 14 years of memories didn't mean a thing anymore. 12 years of marriage gone with one betrayal. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. The next few weeks were difficult, but at least they were clear. Friends and family reached out, offering support, bringing meals, checking in. Everyone knew what had happened, and for once, I wasn't the one being second-guessed or blamed. The house felt quieter, emptier, but also free. No more lies. No more wondering. No more pretending. Then came the second blow. 10 weeks after the night I exposed them, just as I was starting to settle into the idea of moving forward, I found out something that knocked the wind out of me. Julia was engaged. To Richard. I didn't hear it from him. I didn't hear it from her. I found out when one of my cousins sent me a screenshot of Julia's Facebook post. There it was, her hand in the frame, showing off a diamond ring, captioned, "He said yes to forever." And tagged beside her name was Richard. My ex-husband. My sister's fiancé. My cousin followed up the message with a single line. "I can't believe she actually did it." I sat on my couch, staring at the screen, feeling like I'd been punched in the chest. It wasn't just that they were still seeing each other. It was that they didn't even wait. They didn't hide it. They went public like nothing had happened, like their relationship wasn't born from betrayal and deceit, like it wasn't something rotten from the beginning. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry, not in the way I had been. What I felt was something colder, emptier. Like watching the final door close on a part of my life that was already crumbling. Whatever Richard and Julia thought they had, it wasn't love. It was desperation. It was ego. And now, they had each other. So just when I thought I had seen every level of shamelessness that Julia was capable of, just when I thought nothing she did could possibly surprise me anymore, she reached out. It was a Wednesday afternoon, I remember, because I had just gotten home from work and was heating up leftovers when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something in my gut made me pick it up. "Hi Helen," came the voice on the other end. Soft, cheerful, calculated. It was Julia. I didn't say anything at first. I just waited. "I hope you're doing okay," she said, as if we were old friends catching up after a minor disagreement. "I know things have been tense, but I wanted to talk to you about something important." There was a pause, like she was waiting for me to say it was fine, that we could move on, that I forgave her. But I said nothing. She pushed ahead. "Richard and I are getting married next spring. We're having a small ceremony at the vineyard outside town. It's going to be beautiful. And Noel, I wanted to ask if you would consider being our master of ceremonies." The silence that followed was deafening. I thought I had misheard her. I thought it was some kind of joke, some kind of trap. But no, she was serious. Completely serious. She wanted me, her half-sister, the woman whose husband she stole, the one she humiliated, to stand at the front of their ceremony and smile for their photos and announce their vows. It wasn't even the audacity that broke me. It was the calmness in her voice. The total absence of shame. The way she asked like it was reasonable, like it was normal. Like she truly believed I would say yes. That moment, that single phone call, shattered something inside me. Whatever part of my heart was still hanging on, still hoping for closure, still trying to find some logic in the madness, she broke it clean in two. I felt tears well up, but I didn't let them fall. Not this time. Instead, something else rose inside me. Not sadness. Not rage. Determination. I knew then I had to respond. And I knew it wouldn't be with silence. So after Julia's phone call, after she asked me, with a straight face, to be the master of ceremonies at her wedding to my ex-husband, I sat there in stunned silence for a while. But as the initial shock faded, something else took its place. Not pain, not helplessness, something sharper. The kind of clarity that only comes when you've been pushed past the edge. I wasn't going to scream, and I wasn't going to cry. I was going to respond in the most calculated, composed way I could. I was going to say yes, and then take my time crafting the perfect answer. That's when I remembered Travis. Julia had dated him back in college for 5 years. He was her big love back then. They were inseparable. She even got a tattoo with his name on her hip, something she used to brag about when she wanted attention. He was the one who got away, or more accurately, the one who ran away when he finally saw through her. She never really got over him. I remembered how, even years later, she'd bring his name up casually in conversations, always trying to sound indifferent, but never quite pulling it off. I found Travis on social media in less than an hour. He hadn't changed much. Still had that quiet, thoughtful face. I sent him a message. Not dramatic, not emotional. I told him the facts. Who I was. What Julia had done. That she was marrying my husband. That she had the audacity to ask me to host the ceremony. I said I wasn't looking for pity or help, but I was wondering if he might want to grab a coffee. He responded that same evening. We met 2 days later. When I told him everything, he listened without interrupting. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and said, "That sounds exactly like something she'd do." By the time we finished our drinks, he'd agreed to support me. Not just with words, but by showing up with me. At the wedding. As my date. So the day of the wedding arrived. It was exactly what you'd expect from Julia, grand, over the top, designed for social media more than for any genuine moment of connection. The venue was a sprawling vineyard with white roses lining the aisle, a live string quartet playing soft classical music, and guests dressed to the nines in pastel and champagne tones. Everything looked picture-perfect. And then Travis and I walked in. We didn't sneak in or try to be subtle. We waited until the music had shifted to the processional, just before Julia was set to appear. We entered through the main doors, arm in arm, dressed in sleek black, walking calmly but with purpose right down the center aisle. Heads turned immediately. Conversations stopped. People leaned in to whisper. A few gasped. And then Julia appeared at the end of the aisle, bouquet in hand, ready to begin her big moment. She saw us. She froze. Her eyes locked on Travis. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her expression changed from shock to horror in a matter of seconds, and she just stood there, unable to move, unable to process. Then she looked at me. And I swear, for a moment, she didn't know whether to scream or faint. Instead, she snapped. Right there in front of everyone, Julia threw her bouquet down with such force that it bounced off the floor and hit one of the flower girls. She shouted something no one could quite understand, stomped forward a few steps, and then turned back around. She yelled at Richard, at her bridesmaids, at her mother. The string quartet stopped playing mid-song, completely confused. Guests sat frozen in their seats, unsure if they should intervene or pretend it wasn't happening. Then Julia screamed, "I can't believe this!" and ran out of the room in full wedding dress, veil flying behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood there at the altar, unsure of what to do, looking like he'd just been hit by a truck. No one moved. No one clapped. No one said a word. After the scene at the wedding, everything fell apart. The ceremony was cancelled. The reception was never opened. The guests, still in shock, slowly trickled out in silence, murmuring to each other about what they had just witnessed. Julia never came back out, and Richard was left standing alone in front of an empty altar, his perfect day shattered in front of everyone. Word spread quickly that the wedding was officially off. A few days later, it got back to me that Julia had changed her mind about marrying Richard. Apparently, seeing Travis walk in stirred something in her, something that made her start questioning everything. According to her cousin, she cried for hours afterward, saying she couldn't go through with it, that she never really stopped loving Travis, that she had made a mistake. Whether it was genuine or just another one of her manipulations, I didn't care anymore. Shortly after, Richard tried to call me. I let it ring the first time. Then he called again. And again. I blocked his number. There was nothing left to say, nothing I wanted to hear. I wasn't going to give him one more second of my time, not another thread of attention. I had spent too long being a supporting character in someone else's story. It was time to start writing my own. I decided to take a break from everything, from the noise, from the drama, from the wreckage they left behind. I started going to therapy. At first, it was just once a week, sitting in that quiet room, learning how to untangle years of pain and betrayal. But slowly, it helped. I began to rebuild myself, piece by piece. I stopped blaming myself. I started sleeping better. I started eating better. I started making plans again. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself. That's where I am now. Not fully healed, not completely over it, but standing on my own 2 feet and facing forward.